The smoke of 1,000,000 tons of coal hangs invisible over the Thames on a cold January morning in 1934. The river is steel grey, the sky is pewter, and somewhere beneath the scaffolding and the din of hammers, the heart of London is beginning to beat. Inside Battersea Power Station, the first electricity is flowing. Not a trickle, not a test. Real power surging through cables as thick as a man's arm, racing north across the water toward the greatest city on earth. The turbines are turning, the boilers are roaring, and Giles Gilbert Scott, the man who gave this cathedral of coal its soul, is watching from the gallery above, knowing that what he has helped to create will outlast him by generations. He does not know, of course, that one day the building will go dark, that the roofs will be torn off in a desperate bid to turn it into a theme park, that it will stand empty and rotting for 30 years while London built itself up around it, like a city pretending a wound did not exist. He does not know about Pink Floyd, or the inflatable pig, or Apple moving 1,000 employees into its turbine halls. He does not know that Malaysian investors will one day buy it, restore it, and open it like a cathedral that has finally, after decades of silence, begun to sing again. But all of that is coming. All of that is part of the story. This is the story of Battersea Power Station, a building that was never supposed to be beautiful, a structure that was built to burn coal and light a city, and ended up becoming one of the most photographed, most filmed, most culturally embedded buildings in the world. A place that died, was nearly destroyed, was forgotten, was fought over by developers and dreamers and football clubs and Irish businessmen and a consortium of Malaysian pension funds, and was finally, after nearly 4 decades of darkness, brought back to life. It is a story about power, not just electrical power, though there is plenty of that. It is about the power of a city to reshape itself, the power of industrial architecture to become art, the power of a single building to hold a nation's imagination hostage for generations. And it is about the strange, almost miraculous way that something built purely for function, for burning coal and generating watts, became, against all odds, a symbol of everything London aspires to be. To understand why, we have to go back to the beginning. Not to the day construction started, though we will get there. We have to go back further, to a London that was choking. London in the 1920s was a city at war with itself. On one hand, it was the capital of an empire that still stretched across a quarter of the globe. The financial markets were humming. The West End was glittering. Parliament was debating. The BBC was broadcasting its first tentative signals into the ether, and the great red buses were already becoming an icon that the rest of the world would imitate for a century. London was, by any measure, one of the most powerful cities on the planet. It had survived the Great War, survived it, and come out the other side still standing, still functioning, still believing in its own future. On the other hand, the city's power grid was a disaster. Electricity in London at this time was not a single unified system. It was not even close. It was a patchwork, a chaotic, tangled web of tiny power companies, each one serving a handful of factories or a stretch of streets, each one running at different voltages, different frequencies, different standards. The system was a mess, a sprawling, inefficient Byzantine mess that had grown up organically over decades, without any central plan or overarching logic, like a city that has built itself without an architect. If you lived on one side of a street, your electricity might come from one company. Cross the road, and it came from another, generated at a different voltage entirely. The two systems might not even be compatible. Connecting them, linking one neighborhood's power supply to another's, could be technically impossible or prohibitively expensive, or both. Municipal undertakings, small, often privately owned power companies, had built stations dedicated to single industries or clusters of factories. They sold surplus electricity to the public when they had it, but their primary job was serving their own clients. The result was that London's electricity supply was fragmented, wasteful, and desperately inadequate for a city that was growing faster than anyone had planned. The problem was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. It was inefficient in ways that wasted enormous quantities of fuel and money. It was unreliable in ways that left whole neighborhoods in darkness when a single small station broke down or ran out of coal. And it was, increasingly, a barrier to the kind of economic growth that London needed to sustain itself in the 20th century. The problem was so bad that Parliament itself decided to intervene. In 1925, the British government made a decision that would reshape the nation's energy landscape for generations to come. Parliament ruled that the power grid should become a single, unified system. One standard, one frequency, one voltage. And crucially, it should come under some form of public oversight and standardization. The days of the chaotic patchwork were numbered. The private power companies did not take kindly to this, but some of them were smart enough to see the writing on the wall. Rather than fight the tide of regulation and potential nationalization, a group of London's private electricity firms banded together in an act of collective self-preservation. They formed the London Power Company, the LPC, with a single, ambitious, and shrewdly calculated goal: to build, before the government could force them, a small number of truly enormous power stations that would make their smaller rivals obsolete overnight. The strategy was simple, but audacious. If you could build stations so large, so efficient, so modern that no smaller operator could compete with them, you could survive the coming wave of regulation. You could shape the future of London's power grid on your own terms, rather than having it shaped for you by politicians in Westminster. You could be the ones who solved the problem, rather than the ones who were swept away by it. And so, the London Power Company began looking for a site for its first superstation. They needed a location on the River Thames, not for aesthetic reasons. Nobody in 1926 or 1927 was thinking about aesthetics when it came to a coal-fired power station. Power stations, in the minds of most people, were ugly, belching, smoke-blackened monsters that you wanted as far from your home as possible. The Thames was chosen for two very practical reasons. First, the river could provide an almost unlimited supply of cooling water, which is essential to the operation of any thermal power station. The turbines produce enormous quantities of waste heat as a byproduct of generating electricity, and that heat has to be removed and dissipated somewhere. In the days before sophisticated cooling towers, the tall hyperbolic structures that you now see rising from power stations across the countryside, the river was the answer. You took water from the Thames, ran it through the station's cooling systems, and returned it to the river, warmer than it had gone in, but carrying away the heat that would otherwise have destroyed the machinery. Second, coal could be delivered directly by ship. The Thames was one of the busiest waterways in the world, and London's docks were among the most efficient in Britain. A power station on the riverbank could receive its fuel by sea, unloaded at a jetty, and moved into the station's boiler rooms without the need for expensive road or rail transport networks. It was, in the language of industrial logistics, a perfect location. The site they chose was a 15-acre plot of land on the south bank of the Thames in an area called Battersea. It was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a fashionable address. Battersea in the 1920s was an industrial district. Working class, dense, functional, the kind of neighborhood where factories and warehouses sat cheek by jowl with terraced houses and corner pubs. The land itself had previously been used as the site of reservoirs for the former Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks Company. It was already, in other words, a place that had been dedicated to the unglamorous business of keeping London supplied with the things it needed to survive. Adding a power station to it seemed, in a sense, entirely logical. The site sat right in the heart of London's immediate supply area, which meant that the electricity it generated could reach its customers with minimal transmission losses. a crucial consideration in an era when the technology for transmitting power over long distances was still developing. The closer the station was to the people it served, the more efficient the system would be. On paper, the site was perfect. On the ground, however, there was a problem. The local residents and civic organizations were furious. The proposed power station would be enormous, genuinely enormous, on a scale that London had never seen before. Not a small, tucked-away station serving a single factory. Not a modest facility that you could walk past without noticing. This was going to be a monster. A cathedral-sized structure rising from the riverside, with chimneys that would reach 100 meters into the sky and smoke that would spread across the rooftops of one of London's most densely populated boroughs. The protests were immediate and vocal. The building would be an eyesore, people said. An ugly, industrial blot on the landscape. It would belch smoke and poison the air that children breathed. It would damage the facades of nearby buildings with its sulphurous emissions, coating them in a layer of grime that would take generations to clean. It would darken the sky over Battersea and the neighbourhoods around it. And most alarmingly for some of the more culturally minded protesters, it might damage the paintings in the Tate Gallery, which sat just a short distance away along the riverbank, in a building that had once been a sugar refinery and was now one of London's most important art museums. The London Power Company needed to diffuse this opposition. They needed to address the concerns about pollution. That was a technical problem, and they believed they could solve it. But they also needed to address the concerns about aesthetics. They needed, in short, to make the power station not just functional, but acceptable. They needed to make it beautiful, or at least beautiful enough that people would stop screaming about it. And so they hired Giles Gilbert Scott. Sir Giles Gilbert Scott was, by the mid-1920s, one of the most celebrated and widely recognized architects in Britain. Not because of power stations. Not yet. He was famous primarily because of a telephone box. The red telephone box, that squat, brick-red, glass-panelled structure that became as much a symbol of Britain as the double-decker bus, the bowler hat, or the white cliffs of Dover, was designed by Giles Gilbert Scott in 1923. He won the design in a competition organised by the General Post Office, which was looking for a new standard design for its public telephone installations. The competition attracted entries from dozens of architects, but Scott's design, clean, elegant, instantly recognisable, won outright. It was the kind of design that looked inevitable once you saw it, as though it could never have been anything else, as though it had always existed and simply been waiting to be discovered. But Scott was far more than a designer of telephone boxes. He was also the architect of Liverpool Anglican Cathedral, one of the largest cathedrals in the world. A vast Gothic revival structure on the waterfront of Liverpool that took decades to build and remains, to this day, one of the most impressive and imposing religious buildings in Britain. It is a building that commands silence simply by existing. It is a building that makes you feel small, not because it wants to intimidate you, but because it wants to remind you of something larger than yourself. Scott was a man who understood scale. He understood drama. He understood how to make a building feel significant, weighty, monumental, not through sheer size alone, though size was certainly part of it, but through proportion, through the choice of materials, through the way light fell through a space, and the way the eye moved across a facade. He understood, in other words, the difference between a building that is big and a building that is great. When the London Power Company hired Scott, they did not hire him to design the power station. That job, the real job, the engineering job, the job of making the building work, belonged to Leonard Pearce, the company's chief engineer, and a team of engineers and architects that included J. Theo Halliday and the firm of C.S. Allott and Son. Pearce was the man who understood the machinery. He understood the boilers, the turbines, the electrical systems, the flow of coal and steam and water through the building. He was the man who decided how big the building needed to be, where the boiler house should go, where the turbine hall should be, how the coal should move from the jetty to the furnaces. He was, in every sense that mattered technically, the mind behind Battersea. Scott's role was more specific, and in some ways more important to the building's long-term survival. He was hired essentially to make the outside look good. To take the functional skeleton that Pierce and his engineers had designed and dress it, clothe it, give it a face and a presence, and a personality that would satisfy the protesters, the civic bodies, the newspapers, and the general public. He was referred to, in the press of the time, as the architect of the exterior. But what Scott did was far more than exterior decoration. He chose the architectural language in which Battersea would speak. And the language he chose, the style, the vocabulary, the grammar of the building's visual identity, would echo through the station's history for nearly a century, long after the coal stopped burning and the turbines fell silent. Scott designed Battersea in what was known as the brick cathedral style. The term is exactly what it sounds like, and it is worth pausing on, because it tells you everything you need to know about Scott's ambition for this building. The power station was to be designed not like a factory, not like a warehouse, not like the utilitarian, smoke-blackened industrial structures that most people imagined when they thought of a coal-fired power station, buildings that were purely functional, purely practical, with no thought given to how they looked or how they made people feel. Battersea was to be designed like a cathedral, a temple, a place of reverence and grandeur and spiritual weight, a building that would make you stop walking and look up and feel for a moment that you were in the presence of something sacred, even if that something was not God, but the extraordinary human capacity to harness the forces of nature and turn them into light. This was not, it should be noted, an entirely original idea. The brick cathedral style of power station design was already fashionable in the 1920s and 1930s. Several other stations in Britain were built in a similar idiom, drawing on the same traditions of ecclesiastical architecture, the same reverence for scale and proportion and material. Battersea is one of a very small number of examples of this style of power station design that still survive in the United Kingdom, the others being Uskmouth in Wales and Bankside in London, the building that would later become Tate Modern, in an irony that Scott himself, who also designed Bankside, might have appreciated. But Battersea, because of its scale, its location on the most visible stretch of the Thames, and because of Scott's particular genius for making buildings feel inevitable, became the definitive example. The station that everyone else was compared to, the benchmark against which all other industrial architecture in Britain would, consciously or unconsciously, be measured. The style drew on the great Gothic cathedrals of medieval England, the soaring naves, the rhythmic processions of windows, the sense of vertical aspiration, of reaching upward toward something beyond the merely physical. But it was also unmistakably of its time. It was also Art Deco. The interior, in particular, would be lavished with the decorative fittings, the streamlined elegance, the geometric precision that defined the style of the 1930s, a style that was, in its own way, a cathedral style too, a way of making the modern world feel as grand and as purposeful as the medieval one. The result was a building that genuinely confused people. Was it beautiful? Was it monstrous? Was it a masterpiece of industrial design or an affront to the riverside? A temple or a factory? Art or engineering? The answer, as it turned out, was all of the above. And the confusion, the productive, generative, endlessly fascinating confusion, was part of what made Battersea so compelling, so hard to look away from, so impossible to ignore. In a survey conducted by the Architectural Review in 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, a panel of celebrities and public figures were asked to name their favourite modern buildings in London. Battersea Power Station came in second place, ranked equal in the public imagination with St. Paul's Cathedral as a London landmark. Equal with St. Paul's Cathedral. a coal-fired power station designed to burn 1 million tons of coal a year and generate electricity for the capital. Equal with Christopher Wren's masterpiece, equal with the dome that has defined London's skyline for 3 centuries. The city had already fallen in love with it. Before we move on to the construction itself, there is one more issue that needed to be resolved before a single brick could be laid, and that was the smoke. A coal-fired power station burns coal. Coal, when burned, produces smoke. And smoke, in the quantities that a station the size of Battersea would produce, is not just unpleasant. It is genuinely harmful. The sulfur compounds in coal, when burned, produce sulfur dioxide, a gas that, when released into the atmosphere in large quantities, causes acid rain, damages buildings, corrodes stone, and in sufficient concentrations is a serious threat to human health. The protesters had raised this issue loudly and repeatedly. The smoke from Battersea, they argued, would poison the air over one of London's most densely populated areas. It would damage the facades of buildings across the borough. It would, quite possibly, damage the paintings in the Tate Gallery. It was, in short, an environmental and public health disaster waiting to happen. The London Power Company took the concern seriously, partly because they were genuinely worried about the health implications, and partly because they knew that if the pollution problem was not solved, the planning permission they needed to build the station would never be granted. And so they developed, in collaboration with their engineers, one of the world's first commercial applications of flue gas desulfurization. The technique was experimental. The London Power Company had been developing it since 1925, working with water and alkaline sprays over scrubbers made of steel and timber, placed inside the flue ducts that carried the exhaust gases from the boilers up toward the chimneys. The gases were washed continuously as they passed through the scrubbers, and the sulfur dioxide was converted into sulfuric acid using the catalyst iron oxide. The acid was then captured and removed, and the gases that emerged from the chimneys were, in theory at least, clean and smokeless. The condition of the planning permission was explicit. The emissions from Battersea were to be treated to ensure they were clean and smokeless. The power station would be permitted to stand on the south bank of the Thames, but only on the understanding that it would not poison the city it was built to serve. It was a remarkable achievement for the time. Flue gas desulfurization would not become standard practice in British power stations for decades. Battersea, in this as in so much else, was a pioneer. The scrubbing process was eventually stopped in the B station in the 1960s, when it was discovered that the discharge of the sulfuric acid byproduct into the Thames was causing more harm to the river ecosystem than the sulfur dioxide would have caused to the atmosphere. The science had caught up with the technology, and the cure, it turned out, had been worse than the disease. But by then, the station had been operating for decades, and the pollution had, largely, if imperfectly, been managed. Now let us talk about the building itself, not from a distance, not from a photograph on an album cover, but up close. Up close the way a visitor in 1935 might have seen it, stepping off a boat at the jetty, or walking along the riverside path, and looking up for the first time at the full, staggering, almost overwhelming scale of what had been built here. Construction of the A station began in March 1929. The timing, as it happened, was unfortunate. Within 7 months of the first foundations being laid, the stock markets of the United States would crash, and the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe the modern world had yet experienced, would begin to spread across the Atlantic like a disease. Britain would not be spared. By 1930 and 1931, unemployment in Britain had risen to levels not seen since the Victorian era, and the economy was contracting, and the mood of the country had darkened considerably. But the construction continued. The London Power Company had committed to the project, and the station was too important, too central to London's future power supply, to abandon. The workers kept coming, kept laying bricks, kept erecting steel, kept building, through the worst years of the Depression, sustained by wages that were modest by any standard, but were, in a country where millions were unemployed, a lifeline. The main building work was carried out by John Mowlem and Company, one of Britain's oldest and most respected construction firms, founded in the 1820s and still operating today, one of the few companies in British history to have survived continuously for nearly 2 centuries. The structural steelwork was erected by Sir William Arrol and Company, the legendary Scottish engineering firm that had built the Forth Bridge, one of the great engineering feats of the Victorian age, a structure that, like Battersea, had been controversial when it was proposed and became iconic after it was built. Other contractors were employed for specialist tasks. The electrical equipment, the steam turbine turbogenerators, the wiring, the switching gear was produced, for the most part, by Metropolitan Vickers, based in Trafford Park in Manchester. Metropolitan Vickers was one of the great industrial companies of the era, a manufacturer of electrical machinery on a scale that few companies in the world could match. The generators they built for Battersea were enormous. The 105-megawatt unit in the A station was, at the time of its commissioning, the largest generating set in Europe. The building of the steel frame began in October 1930. Once the frame was complete, the construction of the brick cladding began in March 1931. The bricks were laid by hand, course by course, covering the steel skeleton of the building in a skin of fired clay that would endure for decades, that would, in fact, endure to the present day, though much of it has been repaired and restored during the recent renovation. Until the construction of the B station, the eastern wall of the boiler house was clad not in brick, but in corrugated metal sheeting, a temporary enclosure, a placeholder, a visual promise that the building was not yet finished, that more was to come. It was an odd detail, a gap in the otherwise complete and polished exterior, and it would remain until the B station was built to fill it, decades later. The A station first generated electricity in 1933, but it was not fully completed until 1935. 2 years of finishing work, of fitting out, of installing the Art Deco interiors and the Italian marble and the wrought iron staircases and all the other decorative elements that transformed the station from a functional power plant into something that genuinely aspired to be beautiful. The total cost of construction was £2,141,550. In the money of 1935, this was an enormous sum. To put it in perspective, £2 million in 1935 is equivalent, in terms of purchasing power, to roughly £150 million today. £150 million for a single power station. It was, even by the standards of the London Power Company, a consortium of wealthy private firms, a staggering investment. And between the start of construction in 1929 and the first generation of electricity in 1933, there were 6 fatal accidents on the site and 201 non-fatal ones. 6 men died building Battersea Power Station. Their names are not recorded in the sources we have. They are not commemorated on a plaque or a memorial or a dedication stone anywhere in the building. They are, like so many of the workers who built the great industrial structures of the 20th century, forgotten. It is a number that is easy to overlook in the sweep of the larger story, easy to let it pass without comment, as though it were simply a statistic, a footnote, a line in an accident report. But it should not be overlooked. Behind every great building, behind every great piece of engineering, there are men and women who risked their lives, and sometimes lost them, to make it real. 6 men gave their lives so that London could have light. Let us now describe the building in detail. Let us give you its measurements, its materials, its proportions, the physical facts of the structure laid out as precisely as we can, so that you can begin to understand, in concrete terms, what was built here. Battersea Power Station is not one building. It is 2, Battersea A and Battersea B, built in 2 phases, separated by nearly 2 decades, but designed to look from the outside like a single unified structure. This was deliberate from the start. When the London Power Company first proposed the station in 1927, they envisioned it as a two-phase project. The A station would be built first, generating power while the B station was planned and funded. The B station would then be built to its east, as a mirror image of the A station, and the two together would create the four-chimney silhouette that would become one of the most recognizable shapes in London. The building's gross dimensions are 160 meters long by 170 meters wide. That is roughly 520 feet by 560 feet. To put that in perspective, St. Paul's Cathedral is about 175 meters long. Battersea Power Station is, in other words, almost as long as one of the great cathedrals of England, and considerably wider. The roof of the boiler house stands at over 50 meters. That is roughly the height of a 15-story office building. The space inside is vast, cathedral vast, the kind of height that creates its own atmosphere, its own sense of awe, simply by existing. And then there are the chimneys. Each chimney is made from reinforced concrete. Each one stands 103 meters tall, that is 338 feet, taller than the Eiffel Tower's first platform, taller than the BT Tower in central London, taller than almost any other structure on the south bank of the Thames. The base diameter of each chimney is 8.5 meters, roughly 28 feet, tapering to 6.5 meters at the top. They are not decorative. They were never decorative. They are functional structures designed to carry the hot exhaust gases from the boilers upward, high enough into the atmosphere that the emissions would disperse before reaching ground level. Their height is a direct function of the physics of smoke dispersal. The taller the chimney, the higher the smoke goes, and the less harm it does to the people and buildings below. But they are also undeniably beautiful. Beautiful in the way that great engineering is often beautiful, not because someone designed them to look good, but because the requirements of function and the demands of physics have conspired to create something that is aesthetically satisfying in its proportions, its symmetry, its clean and purposeful lines. They are the face of Battersea. Remove them, and the building is unrecognizable. Add them, and the building becomes iconic. The station is one of the largest brick structures in the world, possibly the largest in Europe. The sheer quantity of brick involved is staggering. Millions of individual bricks, each one fired in a kiln and laid by hand, course by course, by bricklayers who worked in teams, in the cold and the damp of an English winter, and the heat and the dust of an English summer, building the skin of a structure that would stand for a century. The construction is of steel frame, similar in its structural logic to the skyscrapers being built in Chicago and New York at roughly the same time. The steel frame is the skeleton. The brick cladding is the skin. Between them, the building is weatherproof, fireproof, and strong enough to support the enormous loads of the machinery inside it. The boilers, the turbines, the generators, the miles of piping and wiring and ductwork that make a power station work. Each of the two connected stations consists of a long boiler house with a chimney at each end and an adjacent turbine hall. The boiler house is where the coal is burned and the steam is generated. The turbine hall is where the steam drives the turbines that generate the electricity. The two spaces, boiler house and turbine hall, run parallel to each other, connected by a series of internal passageways and stairways and galleries, like two great ships docked side by side. The station also had, at various points in its history, jetty facilities for unloading coal, a coal sorting and storage area, control rooms, an administration block, and a network of conveyor belts and towers that moved the coal from the jetty to the boiler rooms in a continuous, automated process that ran day and night, year after year, without pause. It was, in short, a machine, the largest and most complex machine that London had ever built. and it was housed in a building that looked like a cathedral. But it is the interior that truly reveals the ambition of what was built here. The exterior is impressive, imposing even. The scale is undeniable. But the interior is where the real surprise lies. The A Station's interior was designed and supervised by J. Theo Halliday, the architect who was responsible for the appearance of both the exterior and the interior of the building. Halliday was not a household name. He was not, in the way that Scott was, a celebrity architect, a public figure whose name was known to the general public. He was a working architect, a professional, a craftsman, a man who understood buildings from the inside out. And the work he did inside Battersea Power Station is, in many ways, more remarkable than the work Scott did on the outside. The turbine hall was fitted with Italian marble. Not concrete, not tile, not the industrial grey linoleum or bare concrete that you would find in most power stations of the era. Italian marble quarried from the hills of Carrara in Tuscany, where the finest marble in the world has been extracted for millennia, since the Romans first discovered that the white stone of those mountains could be cut and polished into surfaces of extraordinary beauty. The floors throughout the station were laid in polished parquet, wooden planks cut and fitted with precision, sanded and varnished until they gleamed under the overhead lights like the floor of a great country house. The staircases were wrought iron, their railings and balusters forged by hand in a style that drew on centuries of metalworking tradition. And the control room, the A Station's control room, which is today one of the most visited and most photographed spaces in the entire building, was given Art Deco fittings of extraordinary quality and craftsmanship. Dials and gauges and switches and panels, all designed in the streamlined, geometric style of the 1930s, all made to the highest standards of manufacture, all arranged in a layout that was both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The control room was, in effect, a work of art, a piece of design that happened to also be a working space, a place where engineers sat and monitored the output of the station, reading instruments and adjusting controls and keeping the machinery running smoothly. It is worth pausing to ask why. Why did anyone bother? Why did the London Power Company, a consortium of private power firms whose primary interest was profit, not aesthetics, spend the money to line the turbine hall with Italian marble and the floors with polished parquet and the control room with Art Deco fittings? The answer, almost certainly, has several parts. There was the influence of Scott, who had established a tone of architectural ambition for the project. There was the desire to impress visitors, politicians, journalists, civic leaders, members of the public, who might tour the station and whose opinions about the building's place in London mattered. There was perhaps a genuine belief among some of the people involved that industrial buildings could and should be beautiful, that the places where the great engines of modern civilization were housed deserved the same care and attention as the places where art was displayed or music was performed. And there was Halliday himself, who seems to have been a man who simply could not bear to make a building ugly, even if the building was a power station. The interior of Battersea A is a testament to that impulse, to the belief that beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity, and that the buildings we create to serve the practical needs of society deserve, at the very least, the effort of trying to make them worthy of the people who will use them. The contrast with the B station is, as we noted earlier, stark and instructive. When the B station was completed in the 1950s, the money had run out. The war had left Britain exhausted and broke. There was no budget for Italian marble or wrought iron staircases or Art Deco control rooms. The B station's interior fittings were made from stainless steel, functional, durable, hygienic, and utterly without warmth or character. It is a small difference in the grand scheme of things, but it tells a large story. It tells the story of the difference between a country that believed, in the 1930s, that its industrial buildings could be beautiful and a country that discovered, in the 1950s, that beauty was something it could no longer afford. A power station is, at its heart, a machine for converting one form of energy into another. Coal goes in. Electricity comes out. Between the two, there is a chain of physical and chemical processes: combustion, steam generation, turbine rotation, electromagnetic induction, that transforms the stored energy in a pile of black rock into the invisible, instantaneous force that powers a modern city. To understand Battersea, you have to understand this chain. You have to understand where the coal came from, how it got to the station, and what happened to it once it arrived. You have to understand the water, and the steam, and the turbines, and the electricity. You have to understand, in other words, not just what the building looked like, but what it did. The coal came, for the most part, from two regions of Britain, the pits of South Wales and the mines of northeast England. These were two of the great coal-producing regions of the country, regions where the coal seams ran close to the surface and where the industry had been concentrated for generations, creating communities that lived and breathed coal, that had built their entire economic and social existence around the extraction and sale of this black, ancient rock. The coal was transported to Battersea by sea. Coastal colliers, cargo ships designed specifically for the coal trade, carried it from the ports of Wales and the northeast to the jetty at Battersea. These ships were not ordinary cargo vessels. They were specially designed for the particular challenges of navigating the Thames, which narrowed as it passed through the heart of London, and which was spanned, at various points, by bridges that were not tall enough for a conventional ship to pass beneath. The colliers that served Battersea were known as flat irons. They had low-profile superstructures, cabins and bridges that sat close to the waterline, creating a silhouette that was almost flat, almost level with the deck. Their funnels and masts were designed to fold down, to retract into the hull, so that the ship could pass under the bridges of the Thames above the Pool of London without striking them. It was an ingenious piece of maritime engineering, a solution to a problem that was entirely specific to the geography of the river. The London Power Company owned and operated several of these flat-iron colliers itself. They were part of the integrated supply chain that kept Battersea running. Ships owned by the same company that owned the station, crewed by sailors who knew the Thames intimately, plying the same route year after year, month after month, carrying the fuel that kept London lit. When the coal arrived at the jetty, it was unloaded by two cranes. These cranes were capable of unloading two ships simultaneously, at a combined rate of 480 tons per hour. That is 480 tons of coal, roughly 800,000 individual lumps of rock, each one weighing, on average, about half a kilogram, lifted from the hold of a ship and deposited onto a conveyor belt every single hour, day and night, 7 days a week. From the conveyor belt, the coal moved through a system of bridges and towers, an elevated network of industrial pathways that carried the fuel from the jetty to the station's interior and into a storage area. The storage area was a massive concrete box built into the ground beside the station, capable of holding 75,000 tons of coal. 75,000 tons, that is roughly 2.5 months' worth of fuel, assuming the station was running at full capacity. A buffer, a reserve, a guarantee that the station would never run dry, no matter what happened to the supply chain. From the storage area, the coal was moved again, by conveyor belt, through another series of bridges and towers, and into the boiler rooms. There, it was ground down into a fine powder by machines called pulverizers, also manufactured by Babcock and Wilcox. The powdered coal was then blown into the boilers at high speed, using fans and compressed air, where it ignited instantly and burned with an almost complete efficiency. The heat from the combustion turned water into steam. The steam drove the turbines generated electricity, and the electricity flowed out of the station, through cables and transformers and transmission lines, into the grid that served London. The station consumed over 1 million tons of coal per year. 1 million tons every year, year after year, for decades. Think about what that means in practical terms. Think about the ships arriving at the jetty day after day, laden with black rock. Think about the cranes swinging and lifting and depositing. Think about the conveyor belts moving ceaselessly, carrying the coal from the river to the boilers. Think about the boilers themselves, 9 of them in the A station, 6 in the B station, roaring day and night, burning coal and turning water into steam in a continuous, relentless cycle of combustion that never stopped, not once, from the day the station opened to the day it closed. And the water. Water is as essential to a thermal power station as coal. Without it, the station cannot function. The steam that drives the turbines is made from water. The water that cools the exhaust gases is water. The entire system, from the boilers to the turbines to the condensers, is a water system, a vast and intricate network of pipes and tanks and pumps and heat exchangers through which millions of litres of water flow every day. Battersea drew its water from the Thames. The station could extract, on average, 1.5 million cubic metres of water from the river every single day. 1.5 million cubic metres, that is 1.5 billion litres. The Thames flowed past Battersea, and Battersea drank from it, and the river kept flowing, as though it did not notice. As though the removal of 1.5 million cubic metres of water per day was simply part of its ancient routine. One more thing that London asked of it, and one more thing that it provided without complaint. After the end of the war, the waste heat from the station, the heat that was left over after the steam had driven the turbines and the electricity had been generated, was put to use. The London Power Company used it to supply the Pimlico District Heating Undertaking, a network of pipes that carried hot water from the station to homes and buildings in the Pimlico district of London, providing them with central heating. It was an early example of what we would now call combined heat and power, a way of using a power station not just to generate electricity, but to heat the buildings around it, reducing waste and improving efficiency. The B station was supposed to be built in the 1930s, following the same timeline as the A station. The London Power Company had planned it from the beginning. The A station would come first, and the B station would follow, built to its east as a mirror image, completing the 4-chimney silhouette and doubling the generating capacity of the site. Construction on the B station began in 1937. But then the war came. The Second World War changed everything. Britain was fighting for its survival, and the resources that might have gone into building a power station, the steel, the concrete, the labour, the money, were needed elsewhere. Wartime priorities overrode peacetime plans. Construction on the B station was paused, and the station sat half-built, an incomplete mirror of its western neighbour, for the duration of the conflict. The war did not leave Battersea untouched. The A station, which was still operational throughout the conflict, was an obvious target for German bombers. The station's contribution to London's power supply was so significant. It was, by the late 1930s, one of the most important generating sites in the country, that a successful attack on it could have plunged large parts of the capital into darkness. The Luftwaffe knew this. The RAF knew it too, and the men and women who worked at Battersea during the Blitz knew it with a visceral daily awareness that every shift they worked might be their last. After the war ended in 1945, construction on the B station resumed. The station came into operation gradually between 1953 and 1955, a decade after the war's end, reflecting the slow pace at which Britain was rebuilding itself and the competing demands on the nation's limited resources. When it was complete, the B station was nearly identical to the A station from the outside. The same proportions, the same brick cladding, the same chimneys rising at each end. From a distance, from the north bank of the Thames, or from a boat on the river, the two stations looked like a single unified building, exactly as Scott and the London Power Company had planned. But inside, the difference was stark. The B station brought the site's total generating capacity up to 509 megawatts. This made Battersea the third largest generating site in the entire United Kingdom. It provided, at its peak, a fifth of all the electricity consumed by London. 1 in every 5 watts, 1 in every 5 lights that burned in the capital at night, 1 in every 5 televisions that flickered in London's living rooms, 1 in every 5 hospital machines that kept patients alive. 1 in 5 came from this single site on the south bank of the Thames. The B station was also, when it opened, the most thermally efficient power station in the world. Not in Britain, in the world. A coal-fired power station in Battersea, London, was converting fuel into electricity more efficiently than any other power station on the planet. The B station's boilers were the largest ever built in the United Kingdom at that time. Its thermal efficiency was the highest in the country for the first 12 years of its operation. By the time the B station was completed, however, the ownership of the station had changed entirely. The war had accelerated the process of nationalization that Parliament had been debating since the 1920s. In 1948, the UK's entire electric supply industry was taken into public ownership. The London Power Company, the consortium of private firms that had so confidently conceived and built Battersea, that had hired Scott and Pearce and Halliday, and set in motion the whole extraordinary chain of events that had produced this building, ceased to exist. Ownership of the station passed to the British Electricity Authority, and from there, in time, to the Central Electricity Generating Board, the CEGB, the great nationalised body that would control Britain's power generation for the next 4 decades. The irony was rich, and it was not lost on anyone who thought about it. The station had been built by private entrepreneurs who wanted precisely to get ahead of nationalisation, to prove that private enterprise could do the job better, faster, more efficiently than the state. And then it was nationalised anyway. The state took it, quietly and without ceremony, and folded it into the vast bureaucratic machinery of Britain's nationalised electricity industry, and the station kept working, kept burning coal and generating electricity as though nothing had changed. In a sense, nothing had. The boilers did not care who owned them. The turbines did not care whether their electricity was sold by a private company or a nationalised board. The coal kept burning, and the lights kept burning, and London kept going, and Battersea kept doing what it had always done, turning black rock into light. On the 20th of April 1964, a fire broke out at Battersea Power Station. The fire caused power failures across London. The scale of the disruption was significant enough to affect the operations of the BBC, which was, that very evening, due to launch its new television channel. BBC Two, the channel that would go on to broadcast Monty Python, Doctor Who, and some of the most important television programs in British history, was scheduled to begin broadcasting that night. The launch had been planned for months, the invitations had been sent, the press was gathered, the nation was watching. And then the power went out. The launch was delayed by 24 hours. BBC Two did not begin broadcasting until the following morning. It is a small detail in the long history of Battersea Power Station. A footnote, a curiosity. But it illustrates something important, something that is easy to forget when you look at the station today, with its shops and its restaurants and its Apple headquarters and its gleaming Art Deco interiors. It illustrates how deeply, how fundamentally, how inescapably embedded Battersea was in the daily life of London. A fire in a power station on the south bank of the Thames could delay a national television launch. London and Battersea were, by the 1960s, not just connected. They were intertwined. And then, in December 1976, a rock band called Pink Floyd came to the station with an inflatable pig. The pig was pink. It was enormous, large enough to be seen from the north bank of the Thames, from Chelsea, from a considerable distance. It was tethered to one of the station's southern chimneys by a cable, and it was meant to be photographed. The photograph would become the cover of Pink Floyd's 10th studio album, Animals, which was released in January 1977. Animals was a concept album loosely inspired by George Orwell's novel of the same name. In Orwell's allegory, pigs represent corrupt and self-serving authority, the rulers who claim to serve the common good while actually serving only themselves. Pink Floyd's pig was a visual echo of this idea, a grotesque, bloated symbol of power, floating above a building that was itself a symbol of power, industrial power, technological power, the raw, unglamorous force that kept a modern city running. The photograph was taken in early December 1976. The shoot did not go entirely to plan. During the night, the pig broke loose from its moorings. The cable snapped, or came undone, or was not tied securely enough. The precise details have been debated for decades. The pig drifted away from the station, carried by the wind, and floated across London. It drifted into the flight path of Heathrow Airport, the busiest airport in Britain, and had to be located and retrieved by the authorities before it caused an actual collision with an aircraft. But the photograph had already been taken. The image, the power station, the 4 chimneys, the enormous pink pig floating grotesquely above them, was already fixed. And when the album was released, and the cover was reproduced on millions of copies around the world, Battersea Power Station became, almost overnight, famous in a way it had never been before. Not famous as an engineering achievement, not famous as a piece of industrial architecture, however impressive, not famous as a temple of power, as the Architectural Review had called it in 1939, famous as an image, an icon, a thing that people recognized instantly, wherever they were in the world, the way they recognized the Eiffel Tower or the Golden Gate Bridge or the Sydney Opera House. Famous in the way that only popular culture can make something famous, not through books or surveys or architectural journals, but through album covers and posters and television screens and the collective, restless attention of millions of people. Pink Floyd had done something extraordinary. They had taken a functional industrial building, a building designed to burn coal and generate electricity, a building that most people in London walked past without a second glance, and they had made it strange. They had made it beautiful. They had made it matter in a way that transcended its original purpose entirely. The album sold millions of copies. The cover was printed millions of times, and every single time someone looked at it, they were looking at Battersea Power Station. The building had become a cultural object, and from that point on, it could never go back to being just a power station. But even as Pink Floyd was making Battersea famous around the world, the station itself was dying. The A station had been operating for over 40 years by the mid-1970s. Its generating equipment was old, its turbines were worn, its boilers were aging, their efficiency declining year by year as the machinery that housed them deteriorated. The output of the station was falling, slowly but inexorably, as the equipment that produced it became less and less capable of doing the job it had been built to do, and the costs were rising. The costs of maintaining the station, of repairing its aging machinery, of keeping it running at an acceptable level of efficiency, were increasing faster than the electricity it produced was worth. The costs of cleaning the flue gases, of treating the emissions in a way that met increasingly stringent environmental standards, were particularly significant. Flue gas desulfurization, which had been a pioneering innovation when the station was first built, was becoming expensive to maintain, and the technology for doing it had not kept pace with the changing regulations. The economics had shifted. Coal was becoming expensive relative to other fuels. Gas, oil, and nuclear power were becoming cheaper and cleaner and more efficient. The great coal-fired power stations that had powered Britain's Industrial Revolution, and that had continued to power the country well into the 20th century, were becoming obsolete. Not because they did not work. They worked perfectly well. They were simply no longer the cheapest or the most efficient way to generate electricity. On the 17th of March 1975, the A station was closed. After 40 years of continuous operation, 40 years of burning coal and generating electricity and lighting London through the Depression and the war and the decades of peace that followed, the turbines were switched off. The boilers went cold. The electricity stopped flowing. The A station, which had been the heart of London's power supply when it opened, was dead. By this point, the A station's generating capacity had declined from its original output to just 228 megawatts, less than half of what it had produced at its peak. It had been co-firing oil alongside coal for some time, a sign that the coal alone was no longer sufficient to keep the station running efficiently. The writing was on the wall, and everyone involved knew it. 3 years after the closure of the A station, rumours began to circulate that the B station would follow. A campaign was launched to save the building, not as a power station but as a building, as a piece of London's history, as a landmark, as something worth preserving, regardless of whether it could still generate electricity. The campaign was led by preservation societies, civic groups, architects, historians, and ordinary citizens who had grown up with Battersea as part of their landscape, part of their daily visual environment, part of the skyline that defined the south bank of the Thames. They argued, passionately, persistently, and ultimately successfully, that Battersea Power Station was not just a power station, it was a masterpiece of industrial design, it was a cultural icon, it was a building of historic and architectural significance that deserved to be preserved, protected, and celebrated, not demolished and replaced with housing estates. In 1980, the Secretary of State for the Environment, Michael Heseltine, awarded Battersea Power Station Grade 2 listed status. This was a legal designation, a formal recognition, by the state, that the building was of special architectural or historic interest, and that it could not be demolished or significantly altered without the permission of the relevant authorities. The station was protected. On the 31st of October 1983, the B station also closed. Production of electricity at Battersea came to an end entirely. The last turbine turned for the final time. The last boiler went cold. The station fell silent. It was not quite 50 years since the A station had first generated electricity. Not quite 50 years since the first coal had been burned, and the first steam had driven the first turbine, and the first watts of electricity had flowed out of the building and into the grid. 50 years. A blink of an eye in the life of a building that had been designed, by everyone who built it, to last for generations. And now it was empty. Silent. Dark. A shell. The years that followed the closure of Battersea Power Station are, in many ways, the most extraordinary and the most painful part of its story. They are a story of ambition and failure, of grand plans and spectacular collapses, of money and debt and the grinding, frustrating reality of trying to preserve, restore, and reimagine a piece of industrial heritage in a city that is constantly changing and constantly demanding new things of its buildings. The Central Electricity Generating Board, which owned the station at the time of its closure, had originally planned to demolish it. The land was valuable. London was growing. Housing was needed. The south bank of the Thames was, in the 1980s, one of the most desirable stretches of real estate in the capital. Why preserve a derelict, empty, no longer functional coal-fired power station when you could tear it down and build hundreds of homes and offices and shops on the land? But the Grade 2 listing meant that demolition was not straightforward. The CEGB was legally obligated to preserve the building, and the cost of doing so, of maintaining its structure, of keeping it weather-tight, of preventing it from collapsing, was enormous. They were stuck. They had a building they could not use and could not easily get rid of, and the costs of keeping it standing were mounting year by year. And so, in 1983, the same year the B station closed, the CEGB held a competition for ideas on the redevelopment of the site. What should happen to Battersea Power Station? What could this building become if it could no longer be what it had always been? The competition was won by a consortium led by a developer called David Roche. The consortium included John Broome, the owner of Alton Towers, one of Britain's most famous and successful theme parks, a sprawling complex of rides and attractions in the Staffordshire countryside that drew millions of visitors every year. The proposal was audacious, imaginative, and, in retrospect, spectacularly ill-conceived. They would turn Battersea Power Station into an indoor theme park. The idea was not, on its face, absurd. Indoor theme parks existed. The building was enormous, large enough to house rides and attractions and shops and restaurants on a scale that rivaled any outdoor theme park in the country. It was, moreover, right in the heart of London, easily accessible in one of the most visited parts of the capital. An indoor theme park at Battersea could, theoretically, attract millions of visitors a year and generate enormous revenues. The estimated cost of the project was £35 million. Planning approval was granted in May 1986. The site was purchased by John Broome for £1.5 million, an astonishing bargain, a price that reflected not the value of the building or the land, but the burden of debt and obligation that came with them. British Rail even planned to run a shuttle train service from London Victoria to the theme park, a dedicated rail link, purpose-built, to carry visitors from the heart of London to the banks of the Thames. Work began. Machinery was removed from the station, the old turbines and boilers and generators stripped out of the building piece by piece, lifted by cranes. To get the machinery out, huge sections of the building's roof had to be removed. The roof, the structure that kept the rain out, that protected the interior, that sealed the building against the elements, was torn off in great chunks, opened to the sky like a wound. And then, in March 1989, the project collapsed. The costs had escalated from £35 million to £230 million, a six-fold increase in less than 2 years. The money could not be found. The investors pulled out. The theme park was dead before it had ever opened its doors, but the damage had already been done. The roof was gone. The machinery was gone. Without a roof, the building's steel framework was exposed to the rain and the frost and the damp of the English climate. Water got in. It pooled in the foundations. It seeped into the cracks in the concrete and the joints in the steel. The foundations began to flood. Rust began to eat the iron. The building, which had stood for 50 years generating electricity for London, was now open to the sky and slowly, quietly, inexorably rotting. It was a disaster. Not a sudden, dramatic disaster. Not a fire or a bomb or a collapse. It was a slow disaster, a creeping one. The kind of disaster that happens not in a single moment, but over years and decades, one missed repair and one neglected maintenance job, and one failed development scheme at a time. And the worst was still to come. The decade after the theme park collapse was a parade of proposals, counter-proposals, failed deals, and mounting frustration. Each new plan seemed, at the time, like the answer, the solution that would finally bring Battersea back to life. And each one, in turn, failed. In March 1990, a new proposal emerged: offices, shops, and a hotel. Planning permission was granted in August 1990, despite opposition from 14 independent organisations, including English Heritage, the body responsible for protecting the nation's historic buildings. But no further work took place on the site between 1990 and 1993. The plan simply stopped. Nobody moved forward with it. Nobody built anything. The building sat empty. In 1993, a Hong Kong-based company called Parkview International bought the site. The price was £10 million for a building that had cost $2 million to construct 60 years earlier, and that was now encumbered by an outstanding debt of £70 million. Parkview acquired not just the building, but the debt, and set about trying to develop the site into something viable. Over the next decade, Parkview commissioned a series of master plans from various architects. One of the most ambitious was designed by Nicholas Grimshaw, a celebrated British architect known for his work on the Eden project in Cornwall and the Great Western Terminal at Paddington Station. Grimshaw's plan, called simply the Power Station, was sweeping in its ambition. It envisioned a shopping mall with 40 to 50 restaurants, cafes, and bars, 180 shops, nightclubs, comedy venues, a cinema. The A Station's turbine hall would house cosmopolitan shops. The B Station's turbine hall would house designer brands. The boiler house would be glazed over, fitted with a vast glass roof, and used as a public space for art installations and exhibitions. A riverside walkway would run continuously along the Thames from Vauxhall to Battersea Park. It was, on paper, magnificent. On the ground, it never happened. Parkview claimed that 3,000 jobs would be created during the construction of the project, and 9,000 once it was completed. The Battersea Power Station Community Group, a local organization that had been campaigning for the preservation and regeneration of the site for years, pushed back. The plans, they argued, had no affordable housing, no decent jobs for local people, no credible public transport strategy. The scheme was, in their words, a deeply unattractive project dressed up in architectural renderings. Keith Garner of the community group put it bluntly. I feel that there's a real problem of appropriateness. They need a completely different kind of scheme, not this airport lounge treatment. What you see now is a majestic building looming up from the river. If you surround it with buildings 15 stories high, you don't have a landmark anymore. In 2004, the Parkview project stalled entirely. In 2005, a dispute erupted over the chimneys. Parkview, English Heritage, and Wandsworth Council all agreed that the reinforcement inside the chimneys had corroded and was irreparable. Permission was granted to demolish them and rebuild them from scratch. But a coalition of preservation organizations, the 20th Century Society, the World Monuments Fund, and the Battersea Power Station Company commissioned their own independent engineers' report. Their engineers concluded that the chimneys could, in fact, be repaired. Parkview insisted that they had given a legally binding undertaking to the council to replace the chimneys like for like. The dispute dragged on. In November 2006, the site changed hands again. Real Estate Opportunities, a company led by Irish businessmen Richard Barrett and Johnny Ronan of Treasury Holdings, bought Battersea Power Station and the surrounding land for £400 million. It was a staggering sum, more than 30 times what Parkview had paid 13 years earlier, but it reflected the rising value of London real estate and the belief, shared by many in the property market, that the site was finally, after decades of failure, ready to be developed. REO appointed the celebrated architect Raphael Vignoli to draw up a new master plan. Vignoli was a Uruguayan-born architect based in New York, known for his work on the Tokyo International Forum and the Denver Art Museum. His plan for Battersea was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. The centerpiece was a 980-foot-high tower, a skyscraper that would have dwarfed the power station itself, rising from the site like a needle piercing the sky. London's then Mayor Boris Johnson looked at the plans and described the tower as an inverted toilet roll holder. The tower was quickly dropped from the scheme. The revised plans were more modest, but still substantial. Part of the station building would be reused as a power station, this time fueled by biomass and waste rather than coal. The turbine halls would be converted into shopping spaces. The roofless boiler house would become a park. An energy museum would be housed inside the former station. The restoration of the power station building alone would cost £150 million. Planning consent was granted in November 2010. Construction was supposed to begin in 2011. It did not. In November 2011, the banks called in REO's debt. Lloyds Banking Group and Ireland's National Asset Management Agency, NAMA, had been waiting. The debt was enormous. The project had stalled. The money was not there. The REO scheme collapsed into administration, taking with it another master plan, another set of architectural renderings, another dream of what Battersea might become. In the meantime, the building continued to deteriorate. In 2008, English Heritage described its condition as very bad. The World Monuments Fund had listed the site on its World Monuments Watch in 2004, a designation given to buildings and heritage sites around the world that are considered to be in serious danger of being lost. Battersea Power Station, one of the most photographed and most culturally significant buildings in London, was on the endangered list. Chelsea Football Club, one of the wealthiest and most ambitious football clubs in the world, briefly considered building a new stadium on the site. The proposed stadium would have held between 60,000 and 75,000 fans, with a retractable roof. It was designed by Ichok Sport, the firm that had designed Wembley Stadium. In May 2012, Chelsea submitted a formal bid to purchase the site and build the stadium in conjunction with the property developers Alma Kantar. The bid was not accepted, and so the station sat, empty, roofless in places, rusting, flooding, slowly falling apart. While London built itself up around it, glass towers and luxury apartments and gleaming new developments rising on every available plot of land within sight, one of the most iconic buildings in the capital was left to rot. 30 years. From 1983 to 2013. A third of a century. It is difficult to overstate how strange this is in retrospect. It is difficult to understand, looking at the building today, how it was possible for something so famous, so culturally significant, so visually extraordinary to be left in this state for so long. But it was. It happened. And it happened because the economics of redevelopment, the costs, the debts, the planning permissions, the political complications, the sheer grinding difficulty of turning a derelict industrial building into something that could generate revenue, defeated one after another every attempt to bring it back to life. Until the Malaysians came. In February 2012, following the collapse of the REO scheme, Battersea Power Station was put up for sale on the open market for the first time in its history. The sale was conducted by Knight Frank, one of London's most prestigious commercial estate agents, on behalf of the site's creditors. The asking price was £400 million, the same sum that REO had paid 6 years earlier. But the price was not just for the building and the land. It included a £100 million contribution toward the construction of an extension to the northern line of the London Underground, a new branch that would serve the redeveloped site and connect it to the rest of the tube network. Without this contribution, the extension would not be built. Without the extension, the site would not have adequate public transport. Without adequate public transport, the site could not be developed. The £100 million was, in other words, not optional. It was a condition of the sale. Several parties submitted bids. Chelsea Football Club, as we have noted, was one. SP Setia, a Malaysian property company, was another. London and Regional, a property investment firm owned by the Livingstone brothers, submitted a bid. So did the house builder Berkeley. The competition was fierce, and the stakes, financial, political, cultural, were enormous. In June 2012, Knight Frank announced that administrators Ernst & Young had entered into an exclusive agreement with a consortium of Malaysian developers. The consortium comprised 3 organizations: SP Setia, a major Malaysian property development company; Sime Darby, one of Malaysia's largest conglomerates, with interests in trading, plantations, and manufacturing. And the Employees Provident Fund, EPF, which is Malaysia's largest pension fund, a state-run organization that manages the retirement savings of millions of Malaysian workers. The sale was completed in September 2012. A Malaysian pension fund had bought Battersea Power Station. It was, on its face, a surprising outcome, or at least it seemed surprising to those who did not understand the economics of large-scale property development. But the consortium brought something that previous developers had consistently lacked: financial stability, long-term commitment, and the sheer depth of capital that a project of this magnitude required. SP Setia had experience developing large-scale mixed-use sites in Malaysia and across Southeast Asia. Sime Darby had the trading expertise and the international connections to manage a project of this complexity. And EPF, a pension fund, ultimately, had the one thing that all the previous owners of Battersea had lacked: patience. A pension fund does not need to make money quickly. It needs to make money reliably over the long term, and Battersea, developed properly, was a long-term investment. The consortium adopted the existing Vignoli master plan, the plan that had been drawn up for REO before its collapse, and began, at last, to build. The restoration of Battersea Power Station was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious, most complex, and most technically challenging construction projects ever undertaken in London. Wilkinson Eyre, a London-based architectural firm with a long track record of working with heritage buildings and industrial structures, was appointed in 2013 to carry out the restoration of the Grade II star-listed power station. The scope of the work was staggering. The building's shell had to be repaired, the brickwork, the steelwork, the foundations, all of it assessed, stabilized, and where necessary rebuilt. The Art Deco interior fittings of the A station had to be cleaned, restored, and returned to something approaching their original condition. The chimneys, all 4 of them, had to be reconstructed, rebuilt from the ground up, using materials and methods that matched the originals as closely as possible. The historic cranes and jetty had to be refurbished and, in some cases, repurposed. The jetty would become a river taxi stop, providing a new way to travel along the Thames. And all of this had to be done while preserving the character, the atmosphere, and the visual identity of the original building. The chimneys were the most visible and the most symbolically important part of the restoration. Each one had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The originals had deteriorated beyond repair, their internal reinforcement corroded by decades of exposure to the elements. The new chimneys were built to the original specifications: 103 meters tall, concrete, tapering from 8.5 meters at the base to 6.5 at the top. They had to match, not approximately, but precisely. They had to look, from the outside, exactly as the originals had looked, because they were the face of the building, the first thing you saw when you looked at Battersea from the Thames, the feature that made the building instantly recognizable. Restoration work on the chimneys was completed in 2017. They stood again, as they had stood since 1935 and 1955, rising above the south bank of the Thames, 4 concrete fingers reaching into the London sky. Meanwhile, the wider site was being transformed. Phase 1 of the development, called Circus West Village, designed by the architects Simpson Hoare and the firm DRMM, was completed in 2017. It included over 1,500 residential units, more than 23 restaurants, cafes, and retail outlets, and a network of public spaces and walkways that connected the new village to the river and to the power station itself. Circus West Village was, in effect, an entirely new neighborhood, a self-contained community, built from scratch on a site that had been empty and derelict for decades. Phase 2 brought the Northern Line extension, the 2-mile branch of the London Underground that connected the existing network at Kennington Station to 2 new stations, Nine Elms, and Battersea Power Station. The extension opened on the 20th of September 2021. It cost £1,100,000,000 to build. The developers contributed £270 million of that sum, the contribution that had been a condition of the original sale in 2012. For the first time in its history, Battersea had a direct, fast, reliable connection to the rest of London by tube. You could travel from the centre of the city to the power station in minutes, not hours. And then there was Apple. In September 2016, the technology company Apple, one of the most valuable and most recognized companies in the world, announced that it would consolidate 1,400 of its London employees into a single new headquarters at Battersea Power Station. The employees had previously been spread across 7 different locations around the city. They would now be brought together, in one place, in a building that had once burned coal and generated electricity, and was now housing one of the most technologically advanced companies on the planet. Apple would occupy around 500,000 square feet of space within the power station building itself. The move was delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it eventually went ahead, and Apple's presence on the site became one of the most visible signs that Battersea was not just being preserved, it was being reborn as something entirely new. The jetty in front of the power station opened to the public for the first time in its history in 2019. The Turbine Theatre, a 200-seat theatre housed in railway arches beneath the Grosvenor Bridge, opened in September 2019. The wider public realm was master-planned by LDA Design, which created the landscape proposals, the pedestrian routes, and the public spaces across the entire 42-acre site. The Battersea Roof Gardens, located above the Foster and Partners building on the site, were designed in collaboration with James Corner of Field Operations, the firm that had created New York's High Line, the elevated park built on a derelict railway track that became one of the most celebrated and most visited public spaces in the world. The Power Station Roof Gardens, a separate garden on top of the power station itself, were designed by Andy Sturgeon and his team, and won the Garden of the Year Award in 2024, awarded by the Society of Garden Designers. Frank Gehry, one of the most famous and most celebrated architects in the world, the man who designed the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao and the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, was appointed in October 2013 as joint architect with Foster and Partners to design Phase 3 of the development, which would provide the gateway to the entire site and the new Northern Line extension. The development includes over 4,000 homes, of which 295 are inside the power station itself. Over 28,000 inhabitants and 25,000 workers are expected to occupy the site when it is fully complete. The site is owned, as of 2023, by a consortium of Malaysian investors, the same consortium that bought it in 2012, still committed, still patient, still building. The power station opened to the public on Friday the 14th of October 2022. Nearly 40 years after the last turbine turned. Nearly 40 years after the electricity stopped flowing. Nearly 40 years after the building fell silent and dark and began, slowly and painfully, to disappear. The doors opened, and London walked in. Electric Boulevard, a new pedestrianised high street running from the power station to the new tube station, opened the same day. Retail brands inside the power station include Boss, Jo Malone London, Uniqlo, MAC Cosmetics, Space NK, Watches of Switzerland, and many others. Shops and restaurants and bars fill the spaces where turbines and boilers once stood. But the shops are not the point. They are important. They are what makes the development commercially viable, what pays for the restoration and the ongoing maintenance, what gives people a reason to come back again and again, but they are not the reason people come. The reason people come, The reason that visitors and tourists and Londoners and architecture enthusiasts and school groups and corporate delegations and curious strangers all find their way to Battersea is the building itself. The building is the point. Walk into the turbine hall and look up. The ceiling is 50 meters above your head. The space stretches out before you, vast and open and luminous, the Italian marble still gleaming under the lights, the Art Deco fittings still in place, restored and polished and alive. The control room is there, with its dials and gauges and switches, a time capsule from the 1930s, preserved and displayed like a painting in a gallery. The wrought iron staircases are still there, their railings still smooth under the hand, their proportions still elegant, still purposeful, still beautiful. It is extraordinary. Not because it is new, because it is old. Because it is, in the midst of all the newness, the shops and the apartments and the Apple offices and the tube station, a piece of the past preserved and honoured and made available for the first time to the public. A piece of London's industrial history, opened up and offered to the city that built it, nearly a century after the first coal was burned and the first electricity was generated. Before we close, let us spend a moment on the other life of Battersea Power Station, the life it has lived not in the physical world, but in the world of film and music and popular culture. Because this life is, in many ways, as important to the building's story as the life it lived as a power station. The station's relationship with cinema began early. Alfred Hitchcock filmed scenes there in 1936 in his thriller Sabotage, one of the station's earliest appearances on screen, made before the B station was even started. Hitchcock was drawn to the building's scale, its drama, its visual weight, the same qualities that had made it a landmark on the Thames within a year of its opening. Monty Python used the A station's control room as a backdrop in The Meaning of Life in 1983, the same year the station closed. It was, in a sense, a fitting farewell, one of Britain's most beloved comedy groups, filming in one of Britain's most beloved buildings in the year that the building stopped being a power station and became, instead, a mystery. What would happen to it? What would it become? Nobody knew. Ian McKellen filmed the final battle of his acclaimed adaptation of Shakespeare's Richard III at Battersea in 1995. The station served as a stand-in for a wartime setting, its industrial grandeur, its darkness, its sense of menace perfectly suited to the bloody conclusion of one of Shakespeare's most ruthless plays. The Dark Knight, the 2008 Christopher Nolan Batman film, one of the most successful and most acclaimed superhero films ever made, used Battersea as a filming location. Scenes from Children of Men, the 2006 Alfonso Cuarón science fiction film, were set at the station, which served as the fictional Ark of Arts. A pig balloon appears in one scene, an explicit homage to Pink Floyd, a nod to the cultural history of the building, a reminder that Battersea's story extends far beyond the merely physical. In the world of video games, Battersea has appeared in Watch Dogs, Legion, the 2020 open-world game set in a near-future London, where it appears as a redeveloped shopping centre, a prescient detail given that this is essentially what it became in real life 2 years later. And in 2025, the strategy game Civilization VII featured Battersea as a wonder, one of the great monuments of human civilization, available to players who choose to build with Great Britain. It is, in its own way, a remarkable tribute. In a game where players can build the pyramids of Egypt, the Colosseum of Rome, the Great Wall of China, they can also build Battersea Power Station, a coal-fired power station in Battersea, London, ranked alongside the greatest architectural achievements of human history. And then there is Pink Floyd. Animals, the pig. The photograph that changed the way the world saw this building. It is worth returning to it one more time because it is, in terms of cultural impact, the single most important event in the building's history outside of its construction and its reopening. The album sold millions of copies. The cover has been reproduced, parodied, referenced, and reimagined countless times in the decades since its release. The image, the power station, the chimneys, the pig, has become what cultural theorists call a visual shorthand. It means something. It communicates something about power, about industry, about the relationship between the individual and the systems that govern their lives, instantly, without words, to anyone who has ever seen it. Battersea Power Station is not just a building. It is a symbol, and Pink Floyd made it one. There is a moment, if you visit Battersea Power Station today, a quiet moment, away from the crowds and the shops and the noise of the new development, when you stop looking at what has been added and start looking at what was always there, at the brick, at the steel, at the chimneys, at the sheer, overwhelming, almost physical presence of a structure that has been here on this stretch of the Thames for nearly 100 years. The brick is old. Some of it is the original brick from 1929, laid by hand by workers whose names have been forgotten. Men who came to the south bank of the Thames in the depths of the Great Depression and laid bricks, course by course, day after day, in the cold and the damp, building the skin of a structure that would outlast them all. Some of the brick has been repaired or replaced during the restoration, using materials that match the originals as closely as possible. But much of it is original. Much of it is the same brick that was there in 1935, when the station first opened, when the first electricity flowed, when London looked at this building and saw something it had never seen before. The chimneys are new. They were rebuilt during the restoration, from the ground up, using the same dimensions and materials as the originals, but they stand at the same height. They taper in the same way. They cast the same shadows on the river at the same times of day. And when you look at them from the north bank of the Thames, rising against the London sky, you cannot tell the difference between the old and the new. They look as they have always looked. Permanent, imposing. Part of the river, part of the city, part of the landscape. The Italian marble in the turbine hall is old. It has been cleaned and polished and restored, but it is the same marble that was laid in the early 1930s, quarried from the hills of Carrara in Tuscany, shipped to London, cut and fitted by craftsmen who understood that even a power station could be beautiful if someone cared enough to try. The Art Deco control room is old. The dials and gauges and switches and panels are all original, all from the 1930s, all designed by J. Theo Halliday, with an attention to detail that goes far beyond what was required for a functional workspace. They are, in every meaningful sense, works of art. Not art that was hung on a wall or placed in a gallery. Art that was built into a building. Art that was part of the machinery of the building, integrated into its structure and its function, inseparable from the thing it was designed to do. Battersea Power Station is, in the end, a building about belief. About a set of beliefs that were held, at various points in its history, by the people who built it, the people who used it, the people who fought to save it, and the people who finally brought it back to life. It is about the belief that industrial buildings are buildings, full stop, that they deserve the same care, the same thoughtfulness, the same ambition as any cathedral or palace or museum. About the belief that function and beauty are not enemies. About the belief that a city can preserve its past while building its future, that heritage and progress, far from being in conflict, can coexist, can enrich each other, can create something that is greater than either one alone. About the belief that some things are worth saving, even when the economics say otherwise, even when the costs are prohibitive, even when the plans keep failing and the money keeps running out and the building keeps rotting. Some things are worth saving because they are beautiful, because they are significant, Because they are, in some way that is difficult to define, but impossible to deny, important. Battersea Power Station is important. It has always been important, as a power station, as a piece of engineering, as a work of architecture, as a cultural icon, as a symbol. And now, after nearly 4 decades of darkness and neglect and failed plans and slow decay, it is important again in a new way. As a living space, a working space, a public space, a place where people come and go and shop and eat and live and work in the shadow of 4 chimneys that have been rising above the Thames for the better part of a century. The Thames flows past Battersea as it has flowed for millennia, long before there was a city here, long before there was a power station, long before there was anything at all on this stretch of the South Bank except mud and reeds and the occasional fishing boat. The river does not care about power stations or theme parks or Malaysian pension funds or Pink Floyd. The river flows, and the city grows around it, and the buildings rise and fall and rise again, and the Thames keeps flowing. But Battersea is still here. It has survived. It has survived the Depression and the war and the Nationalization and the closure and the theme park disaster and the 30 years of neglect. It has survived the failed plans and the collapsed schemes and the corrosion and the flooding and the endless grinding frustration of trying to bring a great building back to life. And now it is alive again. Now the lights are on. Now the doors are open. Now the people are coming. Tourists and locals, architects and shoppers, students and families, all of them walking through the turbine halls and looking up at the ceilings and standing in the spaces where the great machines once turned, and feeling, in some way that they may not be able to articulate, but that is nonetheless real, that they are standing inside something that matters. On a cold morning in January, any January this year or next, or the one after that, if you stand on the Chelsea embankment and look south across the Thames, you will see Battersea Power Station, the 4 chimneys, the long, low roof line, the brick facade, darkened slightly by a century of river mist and London fog and the slow, patient weathering of time. The building sits on the south bank of the river like something that has always been there, like something that was not built by human hands in the 1930s and 1950s, but simply appeared as naturally and as inevitably as the river itself. It is not the most beautiful building in London. That is a question that has no answer, or rather an answer that depends entirely on who you ask, and what you mean by beautiful, and what buildings you have seen, and what buildings you have loved. London is full of beautiful buildings. It is one of the most architecturally rich cities on earth, a city where centuries of building have piled up on top of each other like geological strata, creating a landscape of extraordinary complexity and depth. But Battersea Power Station is, by any measure, one of the most important, one of the most loved, one of the most resilient, one of the most culturally embedded, one of the most extraordinary things that London has ever built, and one of the most extraordinary things that London has ever almost lost. It was built to burn coal. It ended up on the cover of one of the most famous albums in the history of rock and roll. It was left to rot for 30 years. It was saved by a Malaysian pension fund. It was turned into a shopping centre and a residential complex, and an Apple headquarters and a cultural destination, and a living, breathing piece of London's history. It is, in short, Battersea Power Station. And it is still here, after everything, after all of it. It is still here, and it is still standing, and the chimneys are still rising, and the Thames is still flowing past it, and the lights are on, and the doors are open, and after nearly a century of smoke and silence and music and decay and resurrection, it is, at last, at long last, open. Walk in, look up, and see what London has kept, through all the years, for you.